Welcome to MSL Presents A Question of Law. Thank you for joining us. This program is brought to you by the Massachusetts School of Law and is shown nationwide. The topic for today's show is restraining orders. There was a time in history, and not too long ago, when little attention was paid to abuse of women. But one wonders if the pendulum has now swung too far. Is it true, as so many men argue, that restraining orders are being terribly abused, and that any woman can go into any court and have her husband or significant other ordered out of his home without any proof of violence whatsoever? Query, have the facts become so irrelevant that in virtually every case there's no notice or weighing of evidence because judges are afraid of the consequence of not granting a restraining order, and so they err on the side of caution? Joining me to discuss abuse of restraining orders is the District Attorney for Middlesex County, Massachusetts, Martha Coakley. Prior to that, she served as a special attorney for the Justice Department's Boston Organized Crime Strike Force. From 1991 through 1996, Martha Coakley distinguished herself as chief of the Child Abuse Prosecution Unit, which has been recognized as a national model. Thank you for joining us, Martha. And Attorney Anthony A. Capani has been a practicing trial attorney in the Merrimack Valley for 18 years. He presently has an office in Methuen, Massachusetts, and is a professor at the Massachusetts School of Law in Andover. Delighted you could join us, Tony. And I'm Diane Sullivan, a professor at MSL. Martha, what is a restraining order and what is its purpose?
The restraining order, as we call it in Massachusetts, the 209A, its purpose is to protect public safety. And in a particular instance, the law requires at least a showing that someone is in a relationship, whether it be spousal, boyfriend, girlfriend, other family members, are allowed to go into court and apply with an affidavit under oath, under the pains of perjury, that they believe that they are subject to some kind of physical fear. It does not have to have happened, but threats or other kind of evidence that indicate the person is at risk will allow a court to issue a temporary restraining order to keep the person away from the individual who feels that fear.
Tony, must the judge have some type of evidence that abuse has happened before this restraining order will be issued?
Well, I think Martha addressed that in part. I think for each state you look at the statutory scheme and there'll be a definition as to what constitutes abuse. And usually it's the standard from state to state, and that is either causing or actually attempting to cause physical harm. If someone is in a likelihood of being harmed in the future, or if somebody is forced to engage in sexual relations involuntarily. Those are the definitions, at least in Massachusetts, as to what constitutes abuse. Now, what you have to look at is that there's a two-step process. First, as was alluded to, a woman or a man, whoever is abused, could petition the court by signing an affidavit, and they can get what we call is an ex parte temporary order if there is sufficient grounds and the judge is satisfied. That is without notice, which means that when the person arrives home that particular evening, he is served with papers and he's notified that now he has to vacate. If that's part of the relief that's granted, he would have to vacate the home that he's residing in until he is entitled to a hearing, which is usually 10 days later. So, to get back to your initial question, the judges have a very difficult job in this area. One of the last things I would want to do is be sitting as a judge making decisions in regards to whether or not there's sufficient evidence for the court to grant a restraining order, because it's very, very difficult. One of the difficulties is that this is the type of incident that occurs between two individuals. Usually there are no other witnesses present.
But can I go into court, Tony, and say nothing more than, I'm afraid, and will a restraining order be issued?
I would say it depends on the judge. You have to have something more than that. You have to fill out an affidavit. It has to say, I'm afraid, and you have to articulate particular reasons. So that person have to say, I'm afraid, and give the reasons why she's afraid, and then it's going to be subjective with the court somewhat as to whether or not the judge feels that that person is in imminent fear of bodily harm.
Okay. Martha, do you believe that restraining orders are an effective mechanism to prevent abuse, or are they a false sense of security?
I think both things are true at the same time, and we talk about that a lot when we talk with victims and with those involved in domestic violence in the communities. On the one hand, they can be effective. It's always hard to measure what you prevent, so we don't know what we prevented or when they actually bring the level of violence down or avoid a confrontation or keep somebody safe. There are instances, and we know this, that for some victims or for some women or men, getting a restraining order may be the most dangerous time in their life. That is, if there is anger, if there's confrontation and violence, a batterer is often someone who has to be in control. And so when a piece of paper is given to him that makes him think he's losing control, and his victim, the person that he lives with or his girlfriend, is exerting control, he may go crazy. And so we're very careful with that and understand that it may put people at risk. On the other hand, by and large, there's an enormous number of restraining orders that do issue, and that's one of the questions that I don't believe most of them are frivolous. I don't think people go lightly into court to seek one. There are safeguards for people to question it later. Not everybody lives with everyone, by the way, so it's not that everybody's thrown out of a house. And if two people have a relationship and one says he or she doesn't want it anymore, that should be the end of it, and often restraining orders can affect that. But in situations where there has been violence, where it has not been addressed before, a restraining order can be a dangerous period of time, and we know that a piece of paper does not protect someone.
Is there a profile of a typical abuser?
There are some. I mean, we could talk about maybe a pattern of behavioral characteristics that may lead someone to abuse. Sometimes we see it even in high school students and teen dating violence. It certainly does not fit into any particular educational or demographic or income. We see it across all really spectrum of society, but generally someone who is a controlling kind of personality, and it can be male or female. And remember, it's often, a mother may seek a restraining order against a son or against a child. Women may get them against a lesbian partner or in gay relationships. So, but generally, it's one person has to be dominant, and that domination, when it is questioned or when it is threatened, results in someone who will hit.
And let me just pick up that I'm in total agreement. When a woman, and I'm using this just by way of an example, when she obtains a restraining order, that really can be the most dangerous time, because you have someone who's very frustrated, because oftentimes with that restraining order, there's a no contact order. So there's some unfinished business with that batterer, and he's very frustrated now in that he cannot approach the victim. But what I tell, when I counsel, especially women in this matter or in this area, I tell them, you know your husband or your boyfriend better than any of us. And if he's 6'3", he's 220 pounds of blue twisted steel, and he's breaking into your kitchen that evening. If you go to the refrigerator and under the magnet pull out the restraining order that the court had granted you today, that's not going to stop him. It's not like the movies where if you had a vampire who's ready to attack its victim, you pull out a crucifix and then the vampire shies away. All that restraining order will do is allow the police, when they come to the scene, is to arrest the defendant if he's still there. So it is a very cautious period. And I can't impress enough that women need to understand that, because you can get a false sense of security.
And that's why we actually try and work with those people who get restraining orders to develop a safety plan. In other words, the piece of paper may precipitate more violence, and we need to have steps that you're going to take to leave the home or to go into a shelter or have some place you can go. Many police departments provide women with cell phones that will dial 911. And so I think as we've seen this happen, we've become more educated about what we need to do. And interestingly, I think the number of homicides has actually dropped in relationship for domestic violence, but we have seen an upturn in other kinds of serious violence, whether it's a broken limb or some kind of injury that ends someone in the hospital. So we do know that it's very important to do that safety planning, that the piece of paper is a first step, and it should not be something that puts your mind at ease totally.
I know as a member of the public, not as an attorney, I have to wonder, is a woman who's battered going to really be safe anywhere? I mean, if her batterer wants to kill her, hit her, beat her, he's going to find her and do it, isn't he?
That may be. We can't always and everywhere protect someone, but we certainly encourage people to get out of abusive relationships. I don't think it's an answer to say, well, he may get more angry if you get the restraining order, so submit to this, because we can't guarantee your safety. The reality of the situation is every case is going to be different, and it's going to be somewhat complicated. And the reality is we probably do not have enough resources or help for people who really need to get out of abusive relationships.
With the intense public focus on domestic violence, do you think that defendants' rights are being violated?
Well, in some cases I see that. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't state my observations. It's very, very difficult if you're a male and you're before the court on a hearing, that 10-day hearing, after the initial ex parte order has been issued, it's very, very difficult for you to leave there without having some orders issued against you, unless there's totally no charges. I think judges have a very, very difficult job. If I were a judge, I would not want to be responsible for not having granted a restraining order and then find out the next day that someone was seriously injured or killed. But I do find that sometimes there are some, and it's true of anything that we do, and whenever we enact a statute to address a wrong, it's either applied harshly by the courts or maybe it's drafted too broadly, but that is part of what we have to pay to protect abused people of domestic violence. So that's a small price to pay, but you will see there are some abuses. It's very easy to start a divorce by going down and filing a 209A restraining order, and that will, if the parties are living together as husband and wife, that will get the husband out of the house, and the wife will have a tactical advantage as far as now she's in the marital home. And there's another matter there. Not only is she in the marital home, but there is a presumption of shared legal custody when you go into the probate court. And the judge then has to make specific written findings as to why he should allow shared legal custody at the temporary order stage if there's been an abuse order entered by another court.
Which is what a lot of men argue. They argue that often restraining orders are being used as a first strike to get custody of children.
Well, and as a prosecutor, certainly I don't condone that. Every time someone makes a false claim of rape, for instance, it makes it more difficult for the true victim to get justice because there is a backlash. You could have 100 cases with a restraining order that's appropriate, and if one of them is unfair, that victim, that receiver of that restraining order is going to say the system is unfair because we look at things case by case. And we have to continue to do that. The question should be asked. There's follow-up, obviously. I think the legal profession has a role to play in counseling clients, that the criminal justice system should never be used to gain an advantage in a civil matter. But we do also know that it is an easy and quick way to ensure that there's not another woman on an autopsy table.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about restraining orders being issued against women. How often in your experience does that happen?
Statistically, it's probably a small number. The majority of restraining orders would be by women against men to whom they're married or have a romantic relationship, some kind of relationship. I don't have an exact figure for you, but I would guess you'd agree with me that it's probably pretty small.
Any statistic that you had in that area, I don't know how reliable it would be, because I think men would be reluctant to.
But do men seek restraining orders, and are they refused when the defendant is a woman, or do men just not go to court because they believe they're not going to get them?
I think all of those are true, but the court can issue mutual restraining orders.
But do they often?
Well, I couldn't tell you statistically if the number of mutual restraining orders that are issued. But there are men who go and apply for restraining orders and they're granted, and there are other men that they're not granted. I see a transition of time. I mean, some of the judges that I appeared before early on in my career would never grant a restraining order to a male, but that's changed now. So I see that changing, and it's changing with the attitude of the judges.
Okay, we need to take a break. Please stay tuned, and we'll be back in just a moment. Thank you.
Today's the day you can decide what kind of life your kids and their kids will have.
If we don't do something about global warming will surely do something about them.
Before long, America's heartland might have to live with temperatures over 90 degrees for almost a third of each year.
Chicago now has 2 weeks a year over 90 degrees. In just 60 years, it could expect 2 months each year.
If the weather in Dallas could go over 100 degrees for 2.5 months, imagine what could happen in Phoenix.
If you think global warming is only about warmer temperatures, it's only the beginning.
In our kids' lifetimes, drinking water could be a problem as salty ocean water backs into our rivers.
America's heartland could have trouble growing the corn, wheat, and oats that we need for bread and cereal.
Every man, woman, and child can help make a difference, and that includes you.
The Sierra Club can show you how. Find out today. Your children, your grandchildren are counting on you.
There you go. Hey, close the door. I ain't heating the whole city. That's like born in a barn.
You know, I talked to your mother. You are going to be there for dinner on Sunday, right?
3 o'clock sharp.
Yeah, I see it's empty. This ain't the Ritz, you know.
Dad, why do you keep coming back here?
Oh, he's all right. It's just hard for him to be alone, that's all.
Well, I gotta get going. You coming?
No, I think I'll stick around a bit.
See you Sunday.
All right, babe. I'm buying.
Maybe the last thing you would do for somebody should be the first.
You know I never drink my own stuff.
I'm taking a pretty big chance in myself.
A message from the Credit Union Foundation and your hometown credit union.
Welcome back to MSL Presents A Question of Law. We're discussing restraining orders and abuses of restraining orders. What is the typical penalty if somebody violates a restraining order?
Well, of course, it's going to depend on what that violation is. And this is where, you know, Tony mentioned earlier that if you get a restraining order and there's no contact, a simple phone call may be deemed to be a violation of a restraining order. Most judges are going to look at that in the light of all the circumstances, and there will be perhaps a conviction on that, but not a serious penalty if that's all that happens. If the violation of the restraining order is showing up at the house, knocking down the door, pulling out a gun and shooting at someone or shooting someone, obviously, then you've got assault with intent to murder or murder, burglary, and then you have violation of the restraining order, and all of that will be rolled into the whole context of what actually occurred.
In your experience, do you find that often district court judges just slap the defendant on the wrist and say, don't do that again, stay away from her, and there's really no legal consequence?
Well, I would say no. One of the worst things that could happen to the defendant is that the judge orders him to attend the batterers program. And I say that somewhat facetiously because that's a source of a contention with many men that have to attend this program. Or
do they have to agree to it?
Well, the judge can order attendance to the batterers program, but there has to be some cooperation. And one of the problems that you have is that the male has to, or the person has to admit that they're a batterer. And the series of events that brought him to that place may not lead him to make that statement. His wife could have gone into court and said, I'm afraid my husband's drinking excessively and he has guns and I'm afraid he's going to hurt me, and the judge may issue a restraining order. Then he can contact her after the restraining order is issued, and that's a violation. Now the judge could, as part of his sentence, order him to attend the batterers program. And that's where you have a problem, because he has to admit that he's a batterer, and in his mind he hasn't done that.
Well, and the punishment should fit the crime. I mean, we believe strongly that if there is physical violence involved, if there's actual battering, then that program is appropriate. That a lesser program like anger management, for instance, doesn't really solve the problem and may in fact validate the feelings that the batterer had in the first place. But in order to look at what are the appropriate consequences and what do you do, I think you do, and judges do try and look at the set of circumstances. If there's an order entered against someone to stay away and he violates that order, what's the message to the court? We need something stronger to get a message across to this person, because obviously orders don't work, and this is someone who's going to do what he wants, and that's where the risk of safety goes up, because this is someone for whom violation of a restraining order does not act as a deterrent. So what are courts to do in order to make sure that they are effective?
And Diane, I have several strong feelings in this particular area, where you have a situation where the defendant violates a restraining order, and now the judge has to impose a sentence, and that sentence can include jail time. Now, oftentimes they're going to check with the victim, and it's very easy to say, let's put him in jail. And what I find, and what I attempt to do, if I am representing a woman in a divorce, and this is a natural consequence, this is the criminal portion of this, I do not give her, I don't make the decision for her, but I think women should be informed as to whatever decision they make, how it will impact them. And what I've seen that's been very, very tragic, where a woman has been in court, the husband violated the restraining order, not to the extent that he shot at her or physically beat her up, but he violated it not on one occasion but several occasions, basically by violating the no contact provision, sending flowers and telephoning. And that can be very harmful, because that's showing his continued control over her. But she was all for putting him in jail. And what was the tragedy of this, because I represented a husband in that case, is I tried to work out every possible solution where we could keep him out of jail. Because once he went to jail, he worked for the government, he lost his government job, he lost his health benefits, and the divorce was very easy for me because the bank foreclosed on his house, and now what happened was is the wife ended up with no house. The house was foreclosed on. She got no equity out of that house, and there's no child support, no health benefits because he was in jail. Now there's got to be a way in there.
But maybe that's what she wanted.
But that's fine. But I don't think women are fully counseled. I don't think that they sit down and they see all sides of the picture. And it's the woman's choice. She has to make that decision as to whether or not she wants to be part of the recommendation of having her husband go to jail. But understanding that there are consequences. Because if the husband loses his job, I would feel terrible if I didn't say to my client, if you feel that your safety is utmost concern, and we'll do everything to protect your safety, but understand if you feel you really want him in jail, these are the future consequences that you and your children can suffer. It's her choice and her decision to make, but I don't think women receive enough counseling in that area. I could be wrong.
Well, a party should always know what the consequences are going to be of what's going to happen, because, you know, the other side of the coin happens all the time, too, is that he says, well, if I go to jail, I'll lose my job, and, you know, she accedes because she's thinking of the children, and once again, he is in control, and he's dictated what happens. And that's a fair issue that you've raised. Nobody wants to see someone out on the street or homeless or, again, at a financial disadvantage for a short-term vindictive. And sometimes perhaps we all don't spend as much time as we have. It's a complicated area. And every time, again, we've talked about a pendulum swinging back and forth. You try and protect people's safety. But these are different from other kinds of crimes. When you have interpersonal violence among people who have children, who have other kinds of relationships, everything you do is going to have consequences outside. And your point is a good one, that people should think that through.
Amazing. Whenever you see an athlete or someone who's very famous and wealthy, it's amazing. I just see one day there's a restraining order taken, and the next day there's a recantation that there really wasn't anything there. And I really feel, because someone sat this person down and said, listen, your husband's going to sign a $10 million contract to play sports next year, and if you go forward with this, his contract is going to be substantially less, which means you'll gain less. And I really think that
I know,
happens.
but the other message that can be given to that woman is, he makes too much money, you can't afford this, and guess what? She's stuck in an abusive relationship.
Sure.
That, I think, the other side of that coin has been the leverage by a defendant who has money with lawyers who can say that is incredible, and that's unfair too.
Yes, you're right on that one. I read, and I was shocked that the statistics are, and I know you can find statistics to support anything, that 60% of abusers violate the restraining order. In your experience, do you think the number is anywhere near that high?
That seems high to me, because I know that there are a huge number of restraining orders that are issued. Often there's no consequences. That is, the parties separate, they divorce, and there's nothing that happens. 60% seems high. I can't refute that, and that may be the simple phone call or the sending of flowers. Certainly it's not a violent violation of restraining order, but I do think initially that people don't understand how serious it is or how serious the consequences can be for violating it.
Do police understand that? I mean, when the typical call comes in, how do police respond to calls for violation of restraining orders? Do either of you know?
I think those days they are there. They got a 911 call, they are there. In most cases, their discretion has been taken away. There's a mandatory arrest policy, and even if it's not mandatory, it's often the preferred response. The idea is to diffuse that situation then and there, particularly with the other children, get the parties out of the house. Now, he can be arraigned and bailed the next day and maybe no charges go forward, but their immediate job is public safety, personal safety at that time, and they all, I can tell you, they take it very seriously.
They do.
So was the O.J. Simpson case an aberration, or have things changed dramatically since that time?
I've thought in many ways that case is a total aberration of the American justice system, and often the case that pushes the envelope makes people think the system doesn't work. But of course, you know, you can't judge the system by one extreme case. There were so many factors in that take it out of what happens on a day-to-day basis that I don't think you can say it's typical of anything, really.
I really think even if she, O.J., in that case, there was a restraining order issued and the police did everything they could. If somebody has a mindset to commit murder, a violation of a restraining order is not going to be a deterrent.
Right.
Let me see, if I violate the restraining order, I may have to go into that batterers program or spend 60 days in jail. But if you commit murder, I mean, you're looking at life possibly. So I really think that wouldn't have mattered. in that case.
I think there are certain people who exempt themselves from the rules that govern arrest
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially athletes, but that's a story for another day.
Yes.
Martha, in your experience, Tony's brought up batterer treatment plans. Do you think they're effective?
I think they can be. I think we should know more than we do about that whole issue, about what works for someone in that. I think it's the best solution we have now, and I mentioned that often a defendant will come in, or his lawyer will come and say he doesn't need that, he wants anger management. We really try and push, if there's a reason to believe that it's going to be effective, we'll push for a certified batterers program. One issue, by the way, a side issue, is that we have very few programs for people who batter their kids. We don't know much about that profile, and we see, you know, as kids watch this at home, we see those are the kids who grow up to be batterers or to be victims. So we certainly need more work from other fields, from the mental health disciplines, about the profile and what will work.
So we do need to do something about
For
that.
prevention.
Do you believe most women really want a reconciliation? Is that part of the problem?
Let me just answer, let me ask a question. I think part of the problems with restraining orders and no contact orders is that it effectively precludes any reconciliation unless you have attorneys and you're in the probate court. And I can't believe every relationship out there that there's been a restraining order issued it isn't worth saving. Now, the easy case is when there's physical abuse, it's clear-cut physical abuse, and that woman is in a pattern. There's a cycle where there's the battered woman syndrome, where there's the 3 phases of that cycle. Absolutely, that woman needs to be out of that. But there are oftentimes, I mean, in our human lives, I mean, we have good days and bad days, and I can't think that there's some relationships out there that are worth saving. And what I find the most distasteful about these no contact orders, and I understand the importance of them, is they preclude the parties from reconciling.
We're out of time. Thank you both so much for joining me here. I think it was invaluable. And to our viewers, until next time, be well. Thanks.
When I was about 13, I had the worst paper route in the history of paper routes.
Oh, you look so pathetic wobbling down the street at 4 in the morning on your overloaded bike.
But the last thing I wanted was to admit I couldn't do it by myself.
And the last thing I wanted was to get out of bed.
Oh, remember? The first rainstorm changed all that.
We worked out this great system.
Yeah, well, it was sort of a great system. You drove in the truck while I ran in the rain.
And we decided to make it a weekly event.
Only after you promised to slow down.
We'd start in the garage folding all those papers.
And just talk. That was my favorite part.
And Dad, he'd sit there half awake and mumble something about teaching responsibility.
You know, I think he read more papers than he folded.
No, we were quite the team, weren't we?
Well, I still think you were driving a little too fast, Mom.
Oh, Charlie.
When you put your family first, you're building relationships that last. From the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
7th grade. What was this jumper made of? Naugahyde. You let me go to school dressed like a seat cover. You convinced me that it was groovy.
No. You know, I'm having this wedding here tomorrow, and your weeds are growing through the fence. Do you care?
I see some things haven't changed. Take this to Edna while I change into my garden clothes. Why me? It's you she's been jealous of all these years. You and your fancy wardrobe.
Maybe the last thing you would do for somebody should be the first.
You're planting them too close together.
Edna, it's going to be a beautiful wedding.
Yeah, maybe.
A message from the Credit Union Foundation and your hometown credit union.